So, lesson number 3, we're going to look at why do we avoid the Old Testament? Why do Christians tend to stay away from the Old Testament and keep on the New Testament for the most of it? Why do we shy away? What are we afraid of? Why do we avoid it? I have about 3 main reasons for what I think the Old Testament is avoided by the Christians nowadays. The Old Testament seems too long and diverse. Okay, it also is old and distant from our culture. Old Testament teaching is sometimes very difficult to, when comparing to the New Testament teachings, it seems too distant, too difficult to harmonize, too difficult to relate to what Jesus said to the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament sometimes seems to be a different God from when compared to the New Testament. So let's look into the first. Too old and culturally distant. The Old Testament is old. I mean, the first book was probably written 1400 BC, and probably the book of Job, and it could be even much older than that. We're not sure, but it is about 3,400 years old. So it is a very old, ancient book, and many Christians will be scared by that. They will just, this is just too old and not relevant for us, which is not true, and we will see that later on the course. The Old Testament was also written over a period of 1,000 years, okay, and that creates an issue as well. It creates the issue of too many people writing the books, okay, and too many different genres, okay, and too many different cultures and eras, okay. I mean, what Moses wrote in the Pentateuch might be very different from what David and Solomon wrote, okay, because they're just too far away in time, and that could also be a reason for why we tend to stay away from it. The Old Testament is often full of genealogies and law codes and religious regulations, poetry and wisdom, and occasional repetition. Okay, that there are a few sections of the Old Testament which just repeat itself, and we just find it too weird, and we don't understand why, and stuff like that. Let's look into the how long the Old Testament is. Okay, the Old Testament here, finishing in Malachi, all the way from Genesis, and this on the right here is the New Testament. So the Old Testament is about almost 80%, okay, about between 75 to 80% of the whole Bible, okay. So the New Testament is shorter, much shorter. It's about 25% of our Bible. So the Old Testament is long. It's not also long in the whole picture, but if you check here, if we take away the Gospels and we take away Acts, okay, we have here two Romans and First Corinthians. You can have two long books, but the rest of them, they all seem to be quite short, okay. And if you compare that to the Old Testament, you see that there are huge books in the Old Testament. I mean, it's not only the Pentateuch, it's not only the first few books, okay? There are many, many books that are very long. In the New Testament, we only have a handful. There are the Gospels and John and Acts. Then we go to Romans and First Corinthians. They are like less than half of the size of the Gospels. And then the rest of them, they're just short letters. They're just short writings. And so when we go from Philippians, which is a very tiny book, when compared to Isaiah or Jeremiah, we just tend to be, wow, this is huge. It's just going to take me months to read. And that is one of the reasons we don't read the Old Testament much. Another reason is that the Old Testament is too diverse. It's too different. Okay, it's too there is too much diversity inside it. For example, the New Testament is mostly composed of letters. Okay, letters mostly from Paul. And then we have letters from John and Peter. So most of the Old Testament, the New Testament is made of letters, just short letters to Christians, to churches. And of course we have 5 history books, which is 4 Gospels and 1 John book. And then we have 1 prophecy. Guess which one? Revelation, which we tend to stay away as well. But now the Old Testament is very diverse. It has lots of history, okay, books, lots of laws and lots of poetry and lots of prophecy. I mean, if we stay away from prophecy in the New Testament, Revelation, we tend to stay away also from the prophecies in the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is diverse. It's not just, okay, the great majority is just letters and the rest is just some... No, the Old Testament is spread across 4 different genres: history, law, poetry, and prophecy. And that can create confusion in Christians nowadays. The Old Testament also is not composed by few authors. Okay, the New Testament is mostly composed by Paul, right? Paul is the one that composed most of the New Testament. Luke comes second, okay, and we have just 1 book that we don't know who wrote. That is Hebrews, which probably is Paul as well. Now, the Old Testament is written by a lot of people. I mean, we have a lot of people, a lot of books whom we don't know who wrote. That creates a bit of a problem as well. I mean, the books are very old, so we can't really be sure of who wrote every single book. And we see there that Moses wrote 5 books, and the rest is just, Amos, Daniel, Ezekiel. They all wrote only 1 book. I mean, only 1 book, and it's a lot of books. So many different people writing the Old Testament creates confusion for Christians as well. The Old Testament is sometimes difficult to harmonize with the New Testament. By that I mean, when compared to the New Testament, it seems a different book. Okay, when comparing the Old Testament and New Testament, sometimes we seem like we're reading 2 different religions, 2 different gods. Okay, the Old Testament seems to rarely speak of God as Father, okay, which we really enjoy. Christians really enjoy the fact that God's not only a judge, not only the Creator. He is also our Father, our Daddy. Okay. The Old Testament seems to talk about more of judgment than forgiveness. Okay, so a lot of instances where God is judging in the Old Testament, where in the New Testament it seems like God is much more prone to forgive. The Old Testament emphasizes on earthly inheritance rather than a heavenly inheritance. Okay, so this is what it seems like. If you read it, it seems to us that the Old Testament seems to concentrate a lot on the earthly things, on earthly inheritance. Okay, an inheritance in Zion, in the Promised Land, and for the people of Israel here on earth. And the New Testament is all about an inheritance in heaven. So that creates a kind of a conflict with us. The Old Testament seems to have a very low ethical standard. I mean, we read of God commanding the people of Israel to slay men and women and children and even animals at times. We talk about the holy wars. Holy by holy means, it was God that commanded, and it was with the people of Israel to go to war and conquer kingdoms and countries. And it seems similar to today's Muslim Jihad. The Old Testament contains a number of prayers against enemies. Okay, there are many instances where, for example, with David is cursing, is praying that God would kill his enemies. Okay, and that is very different from what Jesus says: pray for your enemies. Okay, love your enemies, pray that they will be blessed and repent. So that creates another conflict with us. So regarding these issues that we just saw, we are going to try and tackle them throughout the period of this course. We're going to see that there is no reason for us to be afraid of the Old Testament. Yes, it is a bit more complex and requires a bit more attention for us, because it's an old book and it's very culturally different from our world nowadays. But that doesn't mean it is irrelevant. In fact, it actually means it is very relevant, because God revealed himself in a different way on the Old Testament, so that the New Testament times came, we would actually be able to understand. So it is actually almost impossible for us to fully understand the New Testament if we don't know the Old Testament. Okay, the New Testament it was written by Jews mostly, except for Luke. So the Old Testament was written in expecting Jewish traditions and Jewish culture and Jewish Old Testament in mind. Okay, and so there is no reason to be afraid. We are going to look into the issues. We're going to try and explain some of the most important problems in the Old Testament, and hopefully we will be not avoiding the Old Testament anymore, and we are actually going to study it more, because it is very relevant and very precious for our New Testament and our life applications. God bless you.